Thank you very much, Millicent. It's really nice to be here and to work with Great Place to Work, which I've done for many, many years. Really appreciate the data that you've provided on a very important topic for company performance. So what I'm going to look at today is, can human capital management deliver better financial performance? And you might think, well, that's an obvious question. Aren't we all here because we believe that human capital management is really important for a company? But academics have this annoying habit of taking something which is really simple and overcomplicating it. So what is an academic's answer to almost any question? It depends. And I'm afraid that's the answer I'm going to give you, is it depends on how we define good human capital management, because the views of this have changed a lot over time, and even right now in 2024, across different organizations, different firms will have different approaches to managing their workers. So what was the traditional view? So one of the greatest business leaders of all time was Henry Ford. So he was seen as a great innovator. So he's credited with the quote, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. He instead invented the car. Well, actually, that was wrong. He didn't really invent the car. The car had already been invented, but he invented the first way to mass produce a car at scale, and that was using the assembly line. So the idea of the assembly line is, if you force people to keep up with the pace of production, this would make sure that employees will work hard, you'll get as much out of them as possible, a bit like squeezing every last drop out of a lemon. So that's the goal of the assembly line. And obviously it wanted to treat as workers well, but back then there was one way you treated your workers well, which was you paid them. Money was really the only thing that mattered, because living conditions were relatively difficult. He was the first to pay them $5 a day. And the idea is, it doesn't matter how hard you work somebody, as long as you pay them, you compensate them with money, that is enough. And that's why the word compensation continues through today, which I find bizarre. Right? You get compensation for an injury. You shouldn't get compensation for something you love to do. But many people's view is that work is something that you need to be compensated for. And so if you were just to illustrate this with a simple diagram, if you think the value that a company creates can be illustrated by a pie, that pie can be split between investors in the form of profits and workers in the form of pay, or more generally working conditions, a vibrant corporate culture, skills development and training. And often you might think, well, if I'm to treat workers, if I'm to make more profit, I need to take some of that pie away from workers. And so that is what's seen as good human capital management. If I can extract more value from workers through working them harder, then that will give more profits to investors. Now you might think, well, what I've shown you is a bit of a caricature, right? So that was 100 years ago. We don't have those practices anymore. What relevance does that have to 2024? Well, in fact, it does have relevance, because there are some organizations which have similar approaches. So this was my first desk in my first job. I was working for Morgan Stanley in Canary Wharf as a very junior investment banker. And the goal here, again, was if they would work you really, really hard, then they could get as much out of you as possible. And then as long as they compensated you with good salary and promotion prospects, then that was enough. And indeed, what was a great boss? It was one who would squeeze a lot out of his or her workers. It was mainly his back then in 2003. And so there was a boss called William Verica. I shouldn't really mention his name, but he's called him William, who was known as being the terrorist because of how hard he worked his employees. And this was seen as a badge of honor. And that was London. And then I went to New York City with Morgan Stanley. There was a guy called Bill Brown, who was known as Badass Bill because of how hard he worked his employees. So this was what was seen as human capital management, even in organizations like Morgan Stanley, where you think human capital is the most important asset. But what I want to look at, and hopefully this will resonate with a lot of you, is a different way to manage your workers, how even some really successful organizations might not be adopting the most effective approach. So this traditional view is you treat workers like any other input. So with raw materials, You want to pay as little as possible for them and to use up all those raw materials. You don't want any to be unused. That's just inefficient. And so the traditional view was, well, workers are effort averse. Unless you are to manage them, they will slack off. And they are unintelligent or just less intelligent than those at the top. Those at the top, they have a lot of experience. They know how best to do things. So the goal of a manager is to tell those down below the best way to do things and to ensure they follow those procedures. And that might work in some organizations. So organizations, let's say mining, where safety is paramount, you might think this command and control approach is important in order to protect the workers' safety. But the more modern view is that, well, we don't have human resources, but we have human resources. So you focus on the word human here. And so what is different between humans and any other input into production is humans are intrinsically motivated, right? They want to do things that challenge themselves. So often, let's say in a gym, if you have too easy a workout class, some people will be upset. They want to be challenged. They want to do things which have a sense of achievement. And they're also intelligent. It may well be they're closer to the action, so they know better what to do rather than just listening to the boss up high. And so a simple way to think about this is the difference between theory X, where you have a worker refusing to work, and theory Y, where a worker actually celebrates the opportunity to work because this is where they have fulfillment and achievement and can feel that they're really making a difference. So the question is, well, how do we measure whether an organization is acting according to theory Y and having this modern view of human resources, not human resources? Now, there's lots of other measures out there of treating employees well, but some of them have problems. So some of them might be stated policies. So nowadays, I'm sure you could use artificial intelligence to scrape the data on a company's website about how they treat their workers, but you might say something and you might not actually put it into practice. Or you could look at certain superficial outcomes. So something that I obviously care about as an ethnic minority is diversity, but demographic diversity might not actually tell you much about the diversity of corporate culture, whether the culture is inclusive and psychologically safe. And some other measures are good, but they might only be recently available. So right now, in a world in which people are looking beyond just shareholder value, but at stakeholder value more widely, people do understand the importance of treating workers well. There's also environmental measures and measures of responsibility, but that is something which is only recent. And if I showed you that companies that treat their workers well do well, but only based on 5 years of data, you might think, well, it could be that it was lucky for those 5 years, or those 5 years were on unusual economic conditions. Perhaps it works in a pandemic, maybe it doesn't work in different times. So this is why it's been great, actually, for nearly 20 years for me to have worked with the data from the Great Place to Work Institute. So my initial data set used the data in the United States because the best companies to work for list, which is the analogy of the best workplaces here in the UK, that was available from 1984. So I had tons of data. And what data do I have? So what do they measure here? So there's 58 different questions, as I'm sure you'll know. Initially, there was 58 when I was to do the survey. And they looked at specific dimensions. So it's not just, are you happy? But specific elements: credibility, fairness, respect, pride, and camaraderie. And so this is far more than things that you might be able to measure with, say, the CEO to worker pay ratio, the number of days of holiday, or the number of formal days of training. Clearly, all of those things will matter. But what really makes somebody come alive in the organization is not just those stated policies, but how a boss makes you feel, whether they treat you as a person, whether you have opportunities for skills development and enrichment and meaningful work. So what I wanted to do was to look at the companies which are on this best company to work for list. How do they do in terms of shareholder returns? Why? Because there's many people who have this fixed pie mentality, is that if you're treating your workers well, that costs you something that must be at the expense of profit. But what I found was not. It was actually the opposite. And so this was the first paper I published on this topic, which looked at the link between employee satisfaction and firm value. And what I did is I took 26 years of data, if you can read the small print, between 1984 and 2009. And on those 26 years, I found significant outperformance. And then I extended it 2 more years. So when I looked at 28 years of data, then the best companies to work for outperformed in terms of total shareholder return by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% compounded. And I think this fundamentally changes the way that companies should think about human capital management, not as a fixed pie mentality, let's squeeze more out of our workers to give more profits to shareholders, but that the pie can be grown if we're investing in our employees. Yes, that costs us something in the short term, but in the long term, they're more motivated, more productive, more likely to stay, the pie grows, and as a result, then shareholders do better off in the long term. And so you might think, well, there's a conference from the Great Place to Work Institute. Why is it that they have a finance professor come and speak rather than a professor of human resources? Because often finance is the enemy, because finance is trying to keep hold of the purse strings and saying, well, these things are a waste of money. But my research suggests that any finance person with that mindset is not doing his or her job, because what we're looking at here is these things are accretive and supportive of financial value and not at the expense. And what I've done since the paper came out in 2011, over the past sort of 10 plus years or so, is trying to share this with the finance people. And while I'm not going to claim that every single person is converted, increasingly, pure finance people understand the importance of this and are trying to assess corporate culture as being a really important investment criteria. So one firm I've worked with is 91 Asset Management. They used to be called Investec. And so what they developed was a corporate culture framework in order to analyze the quality of a company's corporate culture, believing this to be financially very material. There is another investor, a very leading investor in the UK. She tells me when she meets the CEO, she asks the CEO about, well, how are your people? What are their challenges? What are you trying to do to address them? And she says, well, some CEOs will give a good answer. And other CEOs will say, I didn't know you were going to ask me about my people. Next time I'll bring along the HR director. And so this shows, well, which of the CEOs believe that their people are a CEO level issue and which believe that it should just be delegated to an HR director. And so what I'm trying to highlight here is even if you think, well, I really should care about financial performance, then if you do really care about financial performance, you want to care about the biggest driver of financial performance, which is your human capital. And so what this suggests is that when you treat your workers well, you increase the yellow, but not through giving part of the pie to investors, or taking pie from investors, but growing the pie, and then investors will be better off. Now, you might be skeptical here because you might think, well, is this correlation or is this causation? So I seem to be spinning a story that if you treat your workers well, then financial performance is better because workers are more motivated, more productive, and more likely to stay. But could it be the opposite? Right, once the company is already performing well, then it can start spending money on employees, it can have free gyms and more holidays and so on. Or maybe there's other factors that drive both. So if you're in the tech industry, maybe workers are happy because maybe it's a more fun job than, say, the coal mining industry. And also the tech industry has outperformed the coal mining industry, so maybe it's an industry effect and not a direct link. So a lot of the work that I needed to do was to rule out those alternative explanations and to suggest that it's employee satisfaction that causes financial performance rather than the reverse. I'm not going to bore you with all the ways I did to try to address that, but this is certainly addressed in the work that I did to show that this is the link. So rather than boring you with all that statistical methodology, let me change tack absolutely completely to something I'm sure you never thought you would hear when coming to this conference today, which is jumping out of a plane. So if unfortunately you had to jump out of a plane because it was dangerous, should you wear a parachute? Now you might think, well, this is obvious. Why are academics overcomplicating this? But actually there was a study published in none other than the British Medical Journal, which found that having a parachute has no effect on whether you survive a fall out of a plane. So what they do is they got some volunteers to jump out of a plane, and they randomized it. Right, this is perfect in terms of randomization. Half of them were randomly given a parachute, and half of them were given nothing at all. And they found the death rate was the same number of people died with a parachute as without. Well, how could this be? And how is this study even ethical in the first place? Well, it's because the parachute was grounded. So they jumped out of a plane which was already on the ground, so the jump was 2 feet, so clearly the parachute does not matter. But even if the parachute does not matter, when you jump out of a grounded plane, it could still matter if the plane is 10,000 feet in the sky. So what you find being true for these very small jumps might not apply in a different context, which is a plane which is actually flying. Well, what on earth has that got to do with today's discussion? Well, the importance of context, because if you looked at my old data, this old data was based purely on the United States. Well, I took data from the US best companies to work for, and I showed that in the US, the best companies to work for indeed outperformed, but I can't just assume that this applies to the UK. I can't take something gathered in a completely different context and apply it to a new context like the UK. Just like some of you might know the controversy surrounding Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours rule, the idea that you can become an expert in anything if you practice for 10,000 hours. He took a study which was just in violin playing and claimed that it applied to almost any activity. So, rather than just misapplying something out of context, I wanted to actually do the research myself in the UK. Huge thanks to everybody at Great Place to Work UK for giving me this data. So what they gave me was the data of the best workplaces. And the best workplaces, they're in different size categories, but what I wanted was the ones which were publicly traded so that I could look at the stock price performance. Now, clearly the stock price is not the only measure of performance, but why I wanted to look at stock market performance is you can control for a lot of other factors. So some people might be concerned that if a company builds its human capital, that is risky compared to building plants and machines, because if you go bankrupt, you can at least sell the plants and machines, whereas people might walk out of the door. So I can do things like controlling for risk. But after all of those controls, what I found in the UK was arguably even stronger than in the US. So if you started in 2001 and held the FTSE All-Share Index, then you would have started with £100 and it would have grown to £330, reinvesting dividends. But if you bought the best workplaces in the UK, and then every time a new list came out, then you would refresh that list, then you would get £993.51. That is what's known as an equal weighted portfolio. I would invest in all of the best workplaces equally. But some people might think, well, then you might be disproportionately investing in some smaller companies, and that might be a hard strategy to do. So instead, what you could do is valuate it, where you put more in the larger companies, and that can give you an even higher return of over £1,000. But what we find here, rather than look at the small differences between these, is the big differences between these best workplace portfolios and just holding the market. It does seem there to be strong evidence that treating your work as well absolutely pays off in the UK, just like it does in the US. So what I want to do, and I hope to have some time at the end for some Q&A, is just to change tack to look at some other human capital measures, in fact, more popular ones which have come up quite recently. And this revisits diversity, which I alluded to earlier. So now there's many investors and the media, even customers, which might not look holistically at being a great place to work, as the Best Workplaces study does, but they might look at just one thing, which is diversity, because that might be easy to measure. You don't really need to go in and survey workers. And there was a study which claimed that higher levels of gender diversity are positively correlated with better future financial performance. Now, great statement in the conclusion, but it was not supported at all by the data. So they ran 90 different tests. Not a single one led to a significant result, and yet they claimed to have a significant result in their conclusion. Why? Because they thought people wanted this to be true, they wouldn't actually check the data, and so they made that claim. And this is embarrassing for me because actually it was my own institution, London Business School, which came up with this. But this shows the danger of confirmation bias. We would all like to believe that treating your workers well leads to better performance, but it needs to be backed up by more than just wishful thinking, which is why I had to submit my paper to a peer-reviewed journal to be scrutinized. But let me revisit diversity, because you might think, well, this is a rather uncomfortable thing to end my talk with, if diversity doesn't actually improve financial performance. But does this actually measure diversity? Because there's other ways that you might measure diversity. Often people think that it's actually diversity of thought or cognitive diversity. Now, that might be correlated with gender diversity or ethnic diversity, but it's much more than that, because if you reduce a person to just their gender and ethnicity, you ignore the totality and the humanity of a person. That gives the impression that if you're a white male, you can never add to the diversity of an organization, even if your background is in humanities and everybody else's background is in sciences, or maybe you are the first in your family to ever go to university, maybe you've lived in many countries around the world. So what I wanted to do with my co-authors is to have a broader measure of diversity than just gender and ethnicity, but also to measure equity and inclusion. It's not enough to just have a broad mix of people, but to make sure that they feel included and psychologically safe. And how did I get this broader measure? I went back to the most trusted data source on human resources out there, which is the Great Place to Work. So out of all the questions that they have, some of the questions are not related to diversity. They're things like, I'm given the tools and resources to do my job. But there were 13 questions which we thought were related to this broader measure of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is a psychologically healthy place to work. I'm able to be myself. I'm able to challenge. People here are treated fairly regardless of their age or race or sex or sexual orientation. That can certainly be correlated by the proportion of such people in the workforce, but it's more than that. What matters is not just having people from a broad set of backgrounds in the organization, but making sure that they feel valued. And so what we found with this is that our broader measure of diversity, equity, and inclusion bore very little relationship with the demographic diversity measures that we typically focus on. So there's many companies that are hitting the target, missing the point. So they might be putting certain minorities into the company in visible positions in order to claim to be diverse, but not actually changing anything in terms of the corporate culture. And why does that matter? Well, when we linked this to future performance, we found that our broader measure of DEI was positively correlated with performance along many dimensions: financial performance, valuation, and also innovation. That's the idea that if I have a diverse mix of people, there's going to be better ideas and more innovation, but demographic diversity is not. So a lot of organizations have what I call an add diversity and stir approach. So they think, well, it's enough to bring in a diverse mix of people and then we just allow them to do their thing and magically something will happen. But it's much more difficult that you need to really be intentional about this. So how could you do this? In meetings, it could be something as simple as allowing junior people to speak first so they don't latch onto what the seniors have already said. But even that, you might think, is not enough because sometimes in a meeting, the agenda has been released beforehand, and you hear people discussing the agenda and around the office water cooler, and you figure out what the seniors think. So even if the juniors are called on to speak first, they latch onto what they think the senior will want to support. So there are some organizations like Amazon who have what's known as a silent start. So they do not release any agenda before a meeting or any pre-reading. They devote the first 30 minutes of that meeting to just reading the agenda in silence. And so there's no chance to discuss it. And so when the juniors are called on first, then they are expressing what's truly their own view. Now, the danger of me speaking about something like this is that I have to follow my own advice. So a few days ago, I'm on a board where I got a proposal in from somebody externally, and I thought this proposal didn't make sense, but I thought I needed to forward it to the rest of the board and also forward it with my own comments. So I forward it, and then at the start I said, here is a proposal from X. I appreciate them offering to partner with us, but I don't think this will work for the following reasons. But then I thought, well, that's problematic because then the first thing they would have read was my reaction to the proposal rather than the actual proposal, and so they would be prejudiced by my views. So instead I said, here's the proposal from X. I will put my views at the bottom of the email after you've read it. And then actually people came back to me and said, oh, actually agree with all of your concerns. But when I read into the suggestion, there is a possibility for something else in terms of a partnership which addresses your concerns. And they would have missed that had they been skewed too much by my initial reaction to it. And so this is really important because we often think, well, treating people well, this involves a huge amount of expenditure. Can we put in a yoga studio into our workplace? Now, those are not bad things, but those things are costly. But just small, intentional things to give people time and space to have a different view, those things can really make a difference.